Welcome, everybody. It's a great honor that we have Todd May here from Clemson University, and he's one of the most read people in post-structuralism in North America. Has multiple books that you can view. Has taught for almost 2 decades, I believe, at Clemson in philosophy, and as part of this 2-year project, really, of history of the future, reimagining narrative therapy, we're actually going to start with a real philosopher and helping us reimagine and directions where we've been, where we know where we might go. So, with applause, Todd May. And Todd has been gracious enough to let me do a little, as you know, a narragram, a little outline of how you came to be. Like, I use the metaphor of Spider-Man, how you came to be Spider-Man, and Batman, how you came to be Batman, here, how you became to be Todd May. So where would you begin when you think back at your life, and that would lead to where you come?
Yeah, well, I grew up in New York City at a time when New York City was actually interesting. It was in a mixed neighborhood. It was the Upper West Side. It had different classes, different races, and I also grew up there in the 60s and early 70s. So there was a lot of political activity. I remember one time they had I woke up and I looked out my window and there were thousands of people gathered on the street. And it turns out it was a big anti-war demonstration. I had no idea what was going on, so I went downstairs and joined in the demonstration with a couple of friends of mine, and that was what New York was like. And I think I sort of carried that with me, right, both politically, right, and in the sense of wanting to be involved in things.
Oh, that's outstanding. That was formative in some ways.
Yeah, I think being in a large city, right, like New York, being involved in politics, it was inescapable, right, from early on, and sort of recognizing a diverse culture. All of that, I think, has stayed with me.
And why is that recognition of a diverse culture so important in your life?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. I suppose there's several reasons. Right? One is during the period of Vietnam War, you get inculcated into a set of values, and there's no point at which I've reflected on those values and thought they were the wrong ones. What
are those values?
Well,
you were inculcated.
Right. Presupposition of equality of people, something I'll talk about a lot tomorrow. Not just the tolerance in, but the enjoyment of diverse lifestyles, and then this I think comes from New York, just the value of a certain intensity in living and being involved in things.
So that was quite formative, the values of intensity, equality, enjoying diversity, and various lifestyles genuinely because of this.
And these were all characteristics, I think, of being, or at least I was exposed to all these in New York.
Yeah.
Right, as I was growing up.
So that was quite formative. And so where did this take you as you continue the next part of your story?
Right. Well, let me talk about one part quickly and then sort of lead into what's going to eventually wind up in philosophy, right? Which is that I went to University of Brown, right? So at the time, I think it's less so now, but it was if you wanted to go to an Ivy League school and you want to go to the alternative Ivy League school, you went to Brown, right? So that was where I wound up. And everything, it continued there. Brown had protests. I was involved in the protests. And I took a degree in special education, but never used it. I passed in New York, I passed the teacher per diem, but I didn't do well on the physical. And the reason I didn't do well on the physical was because of question 18, in which they asked me, do you now or have you ever used such habit-forming substances as marijuana, LSD, cocaine? And I said I wouldn't answer the question, right, because it didn't concern my current state of health, and what's more, LSD is not habit-forming, right? And I was told I was sent to the psychiatrist for this, right? Yeah, I was, and what she told me in the end of the interview was, "I'm going to pass you, but," and I quote, right, "you're never going to work in this town because we don't like your kind." And I never did. And I started trying to study then alternative psychology, right? I was reading...
What's your response to that kind of normative judgment and that test, and that you were this drug user, hippie, radical?
Right. And I should emphasize I had hair then too. That was, yeah.
But your response to it was...
well, just to move on, right? I mean, and I had always been interested in philosophy. Right back in high school, I went to a high school where we read novels with a philosophical bent, and so I've always been interested in philosophy. And I after college, I wound up reading a French philosopher. I don't know how people here have heard of Merleau-Ponty? Maurice Merleau-Ponty? Yes, but mostly no. Okay, that's fine. I mean, he's not going to figure large in the story that we're going to tell. But he was important for me, and so I wanted to do an alternative form of psychology, not psychoanalysis, not behaviorism. Right? And so I went into a program in phenomenological psychology. And that was at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. And after my first year there, I started reading Foucault. One of the professors was reading Foucault, right? And so I started to read Foucault, and I started to think, well, maybe the problem isn't which theory of psychology I'm using. Maybe the problem is psychology. So I started raising that in my first year in PhD. You're way ahead of me. It didn't go well. They cut. They. In that town again. I just leave urban corpuses behind me as I go. And so, yeah, they threw me out. And so I started studying philosophy, which is what I had been actually thinking about all along, and eventually wound up in a philosophy program where I could study Foucault.
And I understand you were almost ABD in psychology.
Yes, I think I was like 2 courses and a thesis away. But, I wasn't going to pay to go back to that school. So.
And where did you go then to study philosophy?
I went to Penn State, right? And Penn State at the time had one of the best programs in the area that I was in. I mean, where you study Foucault is in what's called continental philosophy, which is mostly French and German, right? So most departments in the U.S., unsurprisingly, study English language philosophy, right? But there were programs you could study continental philosophy, French and German, and Penn State at the time was a really good one. They've had their ups and downs since then. But so I went there, and I wrote my thesis, which is my first book on Foucault.
Were you pleased with that experience? I mean, we have a trail of academic bodies you've left behind here. And because it seems like it took hold.
I'm sorry?
It sounds like it took hold, this interest in philosophy.
Yeah, no, and I think it was always there. I mean, in some sense, it felt natural to me, right? And still feels natural to me.
Because it reflects these values.
It reflects the values, and it's, I had a student who was asking about philosophy. He was taking my course, and he liked it, and he was trying to explain it to his roommate why he was interested in it. His roommate wasn't getting it, right? And he was frustrated. And I said, well, in some ways, philosophy's for me, like a really good joke, right? If you don't get it, you can't explain it, right? And I just went in to philosophy, and I'm always been like fascinated by the ideas, in addition to all the values, right? But the ideas themselves are fascinating to me. And so I just felt at home with this. And sometimes it has to do with the politics, and sometimes not, right?
But it's cerebration.
Yeah, yeah, and it's following. I mean, people get they get involved, and there are certain things like music or mathematics where people get involved and they say you can keep going forever, right? There's no particular stopping point, right? And philosophy, that's my thing, right? The thing that I could just keep going, however far I go.
And so you began your run, and you've been a philosopher since then. And what keeps I think you're the gasoline in your tank, and it's the ideas, the intensity. Something you can do forever, like being a musician, or and philosophy and intellectual life, and thinking and writing and teaching is just, you love it.
Yeah, and it's also, ideas are things you can discuss with other people, right? And so if you've got good people around to discuss them with, you can just keep going. I mean, as you know, South Carolina is not the place I would have chosen to live, right? I mentioned in the car that a friend of mine, it's a beautiful area, but a friend of mine came to visit me, and after 2 days, his summation of it was, that place is a waste of good land, right? So I've never felt at home there except among the intellectuals there, right? And then we form a community, and then the ideas can just keep going among us.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, and that's your identity: philosopher, activist, writer, teacher, author.
Yeah.
And you just...
And guy who gets thrown out of shit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What do you mean by philosopher?
What do you mean by philosopher?
Good.
The identity. Yeah, identity question.
Well, okay, I guess this could be at least two questions, right? What do I mean by the term, or how am I situating myself in it?
They're both great.
Okay.
I had to answer the first. I have to do a little bit of chronology, right? I mean, it used to be philosophy was the study of everything, right? I mean, when Aristotle wrote books on biology and psychology and physics, but what happened was different sciences developed their own methodologies and broke off, and yet there are still questions left. How should we live? Right? What meaning might life have? What's a just political order? And there are no sciences to answer these, and these to me are the most interesting questions. So philosophy to me asks the big questions that don't have an agreed upon methodology to address them. Not always to solve them, but even to address them. Right? So that's how I think of philosophy. One philosopher described it in a nice way. He said that philosophy is how things, in the largest sense of the term things, hang together in the largest sense of the term hang together. Right? But for me now, I've sort of then begun to answer the question, because the questions that some philosophers are interested in, nature of science, the nature of knowledge, things like that, not so much for me. I'm much more interested in the questions that really seem to resist a scientific method, right? But, meaning of life, how should we act, how might we live, what would a just society look like? Things like that, right? And so I get to pursue those things, and I don't know any place else I can just pursue them, and get paid for it.
Yeah. And I'm just going to finish with this. How did this lead to your connection with the narrative community?
Good, quite by accident. I was mentioning this to Mark, right? Yes. It was all an accident. There is a Danish group called The Spook, run by a guy named Alan Holmgren, and they were having their 20th anniversary in Crete, and I think everybody here probably knows Alan Jenkins, at least by name, right? And Alan was supposed to present and he was ill, so he couldn't present. And one person there, Sarah Walter, had read my book on Deleuze, and she said, "Well, look, Michael had been working on Deleuze before he died, and why don't we invite this guy, right, and see, what happens. The worst comes to worst, we lose 2 hours, right?" So, I got an email from Alan, and basically the email said, "Look, I know you're probably quite busy, but we're having this 20th anniversary, and if you like, we can fly you to Crete, pay you $1,000 for 2 hours, and put you up in a 4-star hotel by the beach, right?" And he said, "Well, but I'm sure you're quite busy." And I said, "Well, as it turns out, not that busy." And so I flew there, right? I did that, and you and I had talked around that same time, right?
It was before that, because
What? Okay.
I was introduced to your work on Deleuze through a workshop in Adelaide by Winslade. Yep. And I said, "Hey, this guy sounds cool. What's he like?" "Oh, I haven't met him." I said, "Well, you quote him all the time through your article." "Yes, I know." And and when I went stateside, I rang you up.
Right.
And your wife, your partner, is a counselor.
Yeah.
And you had no idea there was this thing called narrative therapy that was using Foucault, because you had run from psychology like a madman.
Right.
And so I sent some articles down, and then I just told people about how accessible you were, nice, and not a jerk, and so you got the payoff. I was a handler.
Well, yeah, right, because when we talked, I remember one thing that you said, which is that most of the people in narrative rejected psychology in much the same way that I did, but the difference was they were trying to work an alternative view of psychology, right? Whereas I went in another direction, right? And then have since been involved. I go to Denmark every summer. The thing worked out in Crete, and it was funny because Sarah Walter, who invited me, didn't know anything about me, right, when I came, and her response when I got done was, she said, "Thank God you're not a dick," right? Which apparently from Sarah is high praise. So,
I know.
yeah, but in any event, so that led me to getting. I go every summer now to Denmark, right, to teach for a week or two there, and then sort of I started to read, and and you realize that narrative is in this very interesting place right now, right? Which is, you talked about the history of the future and trying to re-envision it, right? And in Denmark, they're trying to rethink it, right? And part of it is, I think, and now I'm speculating a bit, but it seems to me that you have this person who's sort of a founding theorist, right, who dies, and then people are left thinking, okay, now where do we take this? And it's kind of wide open, right? But rather than keep circulating through the same ideas, people are asking in different ways how to develop this, right? And then I began to see my role with, so I taught, I teach in Denmark. I taught a couple times in Manchester with Sarah. I've taught in Paris there's a group in Paris, as providing sort of philosophical background ideas, then out of which, right, people develop stuff. So I get more, I've learned basically as I've gone, right, about the narrative work that was done and the kinds of issues people are thinking about now.
And I'd like to finish with this final story, which you told that I thought was so Michael and so amusing. And that's what Sarah told you when Michael was studying Deleuze and was preparing to write a work on it. Can you tell how that?
Yeah, it was. I guess he when he died, I guess he was really at the outset of his study of Deleuze. Deleuze is extremely difficult, and it seemed like he was trying to grapple with him. And Sarah told me the story that they went for vacation. They were, I guess partners at the time, and they went for vacation, and she insisted that he take a real vacation, and no theory books, nothing like that. So he says, okay, I'm going to do that, right? So he takes his books, and they're on the beach, and he's reading the biography of Elvis Presley. And he goes in the water, and she's looking, and she says, you know, he never had interest. Where there's interest of Elvis Presley? So she opens up the book, and the cover was his biography, and inside's Deleuze's difference in repetition.
Well, with that, any questions I could have asked? You'd like to answer any concluding comments at this point? In regards
No,
to-
this is great. I mean, I'm just excited to get the conversation going with folks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.